So now we want to start looking at pictures of animal cells and plant cells. This is the picture that's in your textbook this year, and it's very similar to what you had in your textbook last year. And one of the things that you're going to be expected to do is to not only be able to name each of the parts in the animal and plant cell, but also you need to know their jobs. Now, before we get started, what I want you to do first is I want you to look and see if you see any of the parts of the animal cell that you learned about last year. Now, do you see the part that you didn't learn last year? That one of them should be new to you. Yes, down here you can see the word mitochondria. That CH sounds like the K sound. Mitochondria. And you may have seen these structures in the animal cell last year, but you didn't have to know the name of them. So your 4th grade textbook probably didn't even have it labeled. And that word mitochondria, that's the plural version. If you just have one, it's mitochondrion. So what we're going to do is look at each of the parts and what they do, and then I'm going to tell you some things that are going to help you be able to recognize those parts when you see them in a cell on TCAP. Now, you need to know something about animal cells and plant cells in textbooks when you're in 4th, 5th, or 6th grade. One of the things that you should know is that cells are extremely complex, very, very complicated, and each year that you study them, you're going to learn a little bit more than you did before. And we deliberately don't tell you everything about the cell because it would just be too overwhelming. It's too complicated to learn all at once. But even when you get into college, you'll still be studying about cells and learning all their parts and their functions and how they work. One of the things you need to also know about drawings of cells that you see in books is something that I didn't realize when I was a kid. This drawing here, it makes it look like that cells are open on top. But actually what they've done is something we talked about earlier this year on scientific illustrations. They've sort of sliced it open so that we can look and see what it is inside. And even these structures, and we call them organelles, these organelles are the same. They're not open like this. So they've just sort of drawn it so that we can see inside of it. Even the nucleus, which you should have learned about last year, that's not how it really looks. In the drawing, they've drawn it so that it's cut open to allow us to see inside of it. So keep that in mind, that if you were to come across a cell, it wouldn't be sliced open like this. This is actually a 3D structure. Also, this is a good time to point out that cells are what make up every single living thing. And earlier this year, we learned about atoms. Atoms are the tiniest piece of matter that you can have and still have the properties of that particular element. Cells are made up of millions of atoms, and so atoms are not alive, cells are alive. They do all the things that living things do. They reproduce, they produce waste, they get food, all those things. And so cells are actually made out of atoms, millions of them, whereas atoms are not alive, they're just pieces of matter. Now, let's start with one of the ones you learned last year. You should have learned about the nucleus last year. One of the things that you should have learned is that the nucleus is sort of like the control center for the cell. Sometimes teachers will compare the nucleus to the brain, but I think that's a little misleading because brains think and the nucleus doesn't really think. A better description of it is it's more like a manager. One of the things that you'll need to look for when you're looking for the nucleus of the cell is a lot of times when you see one in a drawing or a model of a cell, it looks like a circular structure with a smaller circle inside. Kind of reminds me of a hard-boiled egg. And so you look for something that looks like an egg or an eye. Now this smaller part has not been labeled yet, but when you get older, your other textbooks will point out something called the nucleolus. And you've probably heard about DNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, so no wonder they call it DNA. But your DNA is unique to you, and every cell in your body has the exact same pattern of DNA. Now, you've probably heard about how we use DNA evidence to convict people of crimes because no two people, except identical twins, have the exact same pattern of their DNA. Everybody's similar, but no one's exactly alike. And so if we were trying to prove a case, let's say a bad guy had murdered someone and then there was some blood in their trunk of their car, and they could say, oh, well, that person's never been in my car, and then They would take that blood sample and take it to a lab and look at that DNA pattern and match it to the victims and say, yes, this is the victim's blood. So DNA is pretty powerful. It took us a long time to figure out exactly how it looks. It's basically just a protein, but it has instructions for how your cells work and the things that they do. And it's really a big area of research. There's lots of research about what each part of your DNA does, how it determines your eye color, and there are certain illnesses that come up because of things in your DNA. But anyway, your DNA is in the nucleus. Notice also this folded-like structure around the nucleus. That's called the endoplasmic reticulum. One of the best things about studying cells is the cool words. I mean, you just don't get to say words like that every day. In 5th grade, you don't have to know what that means, but I just thought I'd tell you that that's what that folded-like structure is on the outside. Now, you probably learned about these last year, vacuoles. Notice that in the animal cell, there's more than one vacuole, and if you even look down here in the under part, you can see deeper down where we can't see there are also some more vacuoles. Vacuoles are used for storage, and in 5th grade you need to know that they not only store food, but they also store the cell's water and its waste. Now, it doesn't mix them up, but what it does is it stores the waste until it can be packaged and sent outside the cell. Now, this outer layer, you should have learned last year too, the cell membrane. It's sort of like a thin skin that surrounds the whole cell. It has tiny openings in it, and what it does is it controls what gets in and out of the cell, sort of like the gatekeeper. When the vacuole gets rid of the waste makes its way towards the cell membrane, and those tiny openings recognize it and let it pass through and on out of the cell. And you also should have learned about this part, the cytoplasm. Let me point out something. Notice how the arrow or the line seems to be pointing to a blank spot in the cell. The cytoplasm is sort of like a jelly-like goo that surrounds all the organelles, and it helps cushion them. So if the cell gets jostled, one of the things that the cytoplasm does is sort of like a shock absorber. It absorbs some of that energy, because think about it, if the cell got bumped into and it ruptured the nucleus, that would be bad, and it would damage the cell. So it's sort of like a cushioning agent all around all the organelles and protects them. And also it holds them up, because if there were no cytoplasm, it's sort of like sitting in that jelly goo. If there were no cytoplasm, all these structures, these organelles, would sink to the bottom of the cell, and that wouldn't be good either. So whenever you're looking for the cytoplasm on TCAP, always look for the line or the arrow that seems like it's pointing to nothing. It looks like it's just pointing to blank space. But you should know that all around these organelles is this gooey stuff called cytoplasm. Now to the one you didn't learn about last year. You probably didn't learn about the mitochondria. Notice the shape of it. It looks like a jelly bean to me, but they've sliced it open so you can look inside of it. And inside of it is this ribbony, almost looks like a cord inside of it. I tell myself that it kind of looks like a power cord, you know, the wires to a plug-in. And that helps me remember what the mitochondria do. They're actually the processors of the cell's energy. Now, they don't make the energy, but they sort of manage it and handle it and distribute it. It's kind of like Houston Electric in our town. They don't make the electricity. TVA makes it, and then it travels along wires to Houston Electric, and then Houston Electric distributes it to all the paying customers. So the mitochondria actually process the cell's energy. And it helps me to think that this structure inside of it looks like a power cord, so that helps me keep that straight. Now, let's look at the plant cell. Again, this is the same picture from your textbook. And the first thing I want you to do is look and see what structures are in the plant cell that are also in an animal cell. Yes, you should have noticed that the mitochondria, vacuole, nucleus, the cytoplasm, and also the cell membrane are all in the plant cell. But I want to see if you notice something different. Notice the vacuole. Do you notice anything different about the vacuole of an animal cell with the plant cell? Yes, the vacuole in a plant cell is much, much larger, and also there's usually just one. So in a plant cell, one of the things that will help you recognize that something is a plant cell is that large vacuole. And it also stores water, food, and waste. But one of the things that it does is pretty interesting. You may have noticed that plants, when they go without water for a little while, they start to do something. Yes, when the plant goes without water for a while, I know some of you thought, oh, it dies, but not at first. One of the things you'll notice is that it sort of leans over. We call it wilting. And the reason is because of the vacuole. When the plant's low on water, the vacuole doesn't have anything in it. And so one of the things that happens is when the plant has enough water, the vacuole gets full, and it makes all the cells sort of plump up with this fullness in the vacuole. And then after a while, once you've watered the plant, you'll notice the plant starts to stand back upright again. Now, another thing I want you to do now is notice there are two additional structures that weren't in animal cells. See if you can spot them. Right. You probably noticed that there was no chloroplast in an animal cell, and there wasn't a cell wall. Now, I want you to make sure that you understand why animal cells don't have chloroplasts and why animal cells don't have a cell wall. One of the things is that the chloroplast, the reason that animal cells don't have chloroplast is what the chloroplast is used for. Inside the chloroplast are these tiny structures that actually absorb the sun's energy, and the plant uses that when it makes its food. You learned about photosynthesis last year. That's where all this is happening, in the chloroplast. And so since animals don't make their own food, they have to get food from outside sources, they don't need chloroplasts. And this also explains why plants are green. The chloroplasts have a chemical in them called chlorophyll, and it's green. And so that gives plants their green colors. Anytime you see the green part on a plant, you should know that that's the photosynthesis going on in the plant. A good way to identify the chloroplast is that it also is shaped like a jelly bean, but notice the inside is different. Inside the mitochondria, it looks like a power core, but inside the chloroplast, to me, it looks like little stacks of green coins. Notice that there are multiple of them in the plant cell. The other part that a plant cell has that animal cells don't have is the cell wall. Animal cells don't have a cell wall, and it's because they don't need one. The cell wall actually gives the plant cell strength and structure. It helps it hold its shape, and it's a stiff outer covering for the plant cell. Notice that the plant cell still has a cell membrane, but the cell wall is on the outside. The cell wall gives it structure. It supports it. Animal cells don't need this because animals have a system that does that for them, a skeletal system. You know, if you go outside and you chop one of the branches off of a tree, you're not going to see a bone stuck inside there. Because plants don't have a skeletal system, every single cell in a plant has a stiff outer covering that helps give it strength and support. The cell wall is made out of a material called cellulose, and you may have heard people say, oh, you should eat lots of plant materials foods from plants in order to be healthy. You need lots of fiber, and whenever you eat fiber, that's where you get it from plants, eating wheat and vegetables and fruit. And that cellulose that's in the cell wall, that's the part that's the fiber, and our body has trouble digesting it. So whenever you eat something from a plant, it actually makes your digestive system work a little bit better, work a little bit harder, and keeps everything running free and clear. So plants have a cell wall because they don't have a skeletal system. Since animals don't have cell walls, they need a skeletal system to give them strength and support. So the two parts that plant cells have that animal cells don't are the chloroplast, because animal cells don't make their own food, they don't need that. And then the cell wall. Animals have a skeletal system, and so they don't need that extra support that comes from that cell wall. Now I want to look at plant and animal cells side by side, and I want to talk to you just for a second about how to tell them apart. These pictures are familiar to you because you've seen them in your textbook, but they're not going to be the pictures that are on TCAP. And one of the things that you'll need to do is recognize right away whether it's a plant cell or an animal cell, and there's a couple of things that help you do that. First of all, if you see the chloroplast, you know it's got to be a plant cell. Animal cells don't have chloroplast. They don't make their own food. But since plants have to produce their own food, that's why we call them producers, they need that chloroplast to absorb the sunlight energy and convert it and use it to make its sugar. And then also, if you see that double layer here with the cell wall and the cell membrane, then you know that's a plant cell. But another thing that will tip you off that it's a plant cell is the presence of one large vacuole. Notice that animal cells have several small ones. Plant cell has one giant one. And then the final thing that you can use to let you know it's a plant cell is the shape of it. Notice the shape of an animal cell versus a plant cell. Usually, not always, but usually animal cells have a more rounded shape than plant cells, especially on the teacap. They're not going to show you anything really unusual, I don't think, on the teacap. So typically you'll see a plant cell and it'll have more of a box-like shape. Notice that it's not necessarily a perfect square, but it has those squared off edges. You don't see that in animal cells.